Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are thrilled to be joined by our guest, Sarah Shibutse. Sarah is the Director of Standards and Compliance at the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, and she'll be telling us more about the agency as well as anti-doping efforts in Kenya. So, Sarah, thank you so much for being here on the show with us today. How are you?
I'm fine, Dr. Marie, and thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we are so excited to learn more about you and all the wonderful work you've been doing there. So can you start by telling us more about yourself and your work?
Thank you, Marie. So my name is Sarah Shibutse, and I am the Director of Standards and Compliance at the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya. And my main work in the agency is to oversee the protection of clean athletes, mainly by carrying out effective doping tests. I'm in charge of intelligence and investigations. We also do the initial review for any anti-doping rule violations that have come in. We also take care of any therapeutic use exemptions that have been requested for by athletes. And lastly, we do compliance audits for our national sports federations just to ensure that they are complying with the Kenya anti-doping rules and the anti-doping policy, all which are instruments that were created to be in tandem with the World Anti-Doping Code. So that in a nutshell is what I do at the agency.
Excellent. So Sarah, how did you find your way into this field of anti-doping?
That's an interesting story. I was initially working at the Ministry of Sports, Culture and Heritage in the Department of Sports. I was a sports officer there, and I had worked there for 18 years up to around 2015. While I was a sports officer and at the department, I was also acting as the personal assistant to the Secretary of Sports. That was the head of the Department of Sports. So all things anti-doping were coming through him. And he is the one who then requested me to get into the field of anti-doping and to act as the link between WADA and the department and the ministry. And that is how we started having meetings between the department and WADA. And WADA brought in Anti-Doping Norway and China Anti-Doping just to see if they can assist Kenya in establishing a NADO. And I was the secretariat to that meeting. So that is how I started. And when the government of Kenya decided to establish a NADO, they seconded me. I was actually one of the first people to be seconded to ADAK to start working. But also prior to my secondment at ADAK, I was also a joint secretary to an anti-doping task force that had been created by the then Minister of Sports. So that is how I got into the world of anti-doping, and here I am.
Wonderful. And I know you've seen a lot of the evolution happen over time. So can you tell us a little bit more about the history of the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya and maybe some of the milestones you've had along the way?
So you know about the UNESCO Convention Against Doping in Sport, and Kenya is a signatory to that. We signed in August of 2009. And then further to that, the World Anti-Doping Code requests governments to put in place measures to enhance cooperation and sharing of information and data with other anti-doping organizations. So it's against this background that ADAK was formed and established through an anti-doping act in 2016. And ADAK is a state corporation that is then parented at the Ministry of Sports in Kenya. And one of the key goals for establishing the agency was to protect athletes and their fundamental rights to participate in doping-free sports. ADAK is now, from 2016 to date, is now about 5 years old. We have 3 main technical departments, and the departments are Standards and Compliance, which I head. There is also the Department of Education and Research, and there's also the Division of Results Management or Legal Services, which handles both results management and any other legal services that the agency may need. Initially, when ADAK started, the Ministry of Sports had seconded 12 staff from the Ministry of Sports to ADAK to start working. And these are the staff that established all the documents, the policy documents, the human resource manuals, the organization structure, all those documents that would then allow ADAK to start employing staff. And to date now, we have employed staff, and I think we are doing a good job because we have started testing. I mean, we didn't know what testing was all about previously. We have started testing. We have done a lot of anti-doping education and outreach. We have prosecuted quite a number of anti-doping rule violation cases. We have done a number of compliance audits on our sports federations. So those are some of the milestones that ADAK has achieved.
Certainly. And I think starting up a NADO is a ton of work. So what was it like for you kind of being there in that moment where it was formed and looking at maybe this pile of work in front of you?
Daunting, very daunting. As you rightly put it, it's a ton of work. Starting any organization, not only a NADO, it's a lot of work. And we used to sleep very late. And this was something that had not been in Kenya before. I mean, we didn't understand what anti-doping was all about. So even just reading about what WADA is, what it stands for, what is expected of a NADO, what we will need to do to have a fully established NADO, or at least a NADO that can start running programs in Kenya. It was a lot of work. And there were many months that we hardly caught any sleep and going up and down, trying to establish this, looking for offices because WADA insists on a NADO being independent from the parent ministry, operationally and functionally, everything. So we did put in a lot of work, my colleagues and I, just to have the NADO up and running.
Oh, absolutely. And prior to that, several years ago, you mentioned you served as Joint Secretary for the Anti-Doping Task Force to investigate the extent of doping in Kenya and really understand what was going on. So can you tell us a little bit more about why this task force was formed and maybe what were the goals of this task force going into it?
So there's undercover investigation that was carried out by a German television station called ARD. And they reported that in Kenya, there's a lot of doping going on, especially in athletics, and a lot of EPO, that is erythropoietin, and other doping products like anabolic steroids were readily available to the athletes to take. And so this came out just before a major competition, and it brought a hue and cry in the country. So the Minister of Sports then was charged with the task of forming a task force just to investigate whether what this German television was saying was true. If yes, it was true, then to what extent the Kenyan sportsmen and women indulging in doping. And if it was not true, then why they would have come up with such a video. So the main goal actually for the task force was to investigate the involvement of the person or persons, either sports persons or their support personnel in the administration or the supply of drugs to the athletes. And as I said, the extent of the doping and how available are the banned substances in Kenya. That is why the task force was formed in 2013. And we finished our investigation. We had been given a period of 6 months. So by 2014, early 2014, we had completed and did a report and launched it and gave it back to the ministry.
Certainly. And Sarah, can you tell us what were some of the main findings of the report and were there any surprises for you?
The most surprising thing is that I think as a country, we know that we have athletes who are very talented, especially in athletics. And so we have always known that when our athletes are competing, they are doing it with the talent that they have. So it was quite surprising to find out during the investigations while in the task force that there are few athletes who are actually doping and doing it knowingly. But there are those then other athletes who are up and coming, who maybe do not know what they're being given to take, and they are doping largely out of ignorance. But then again, the number of athletes who are coming up every day is very big. So I think there's a lot of competition, and we found that there are some up-and-coming athletes are not patient to go through the rigorous training to be able to win their races. So they want a faster way out. And that was one of the things that led them to dope. But the other findings that we got is that it's not only in athletics that there's use of prohibited substances. Some are recreational, some are used across all sports. And we also found that the sports federations in Kenya, the national sports federations, do not have elaborate programs on anti-doping education and awareness, on testing of athletes. They didn't understand, or they were ignorant about the whole issue of anti-doping. I mean, they didn't see any need to have this. It was like, it's not touching on them, it's touching on other people. But the other thing is that, as I said earlier, there's a category of athletes who deliberately use the performance-enhancing substances to enhance their performance so that they can win more and win faster rather than just train. And then we also realized as a task force that the major sources of the prohibited substances are chemists and hospitals and a few shops that sell food supplements. Those were the key findings that we had in the investigations.
Certainly. And I think having this information as you're starting the process is really important. So once you had this report together, Sarah, what were some of the key actions that the group decided to take after this task force delivered the final report?
The key actions that were taken, because this report, as I told you, was handed over to the minister in charge of sports, since he is the one who commissioned the task force. So what they decided to do is to create or establish a national anti-doping organization, because that was the major recommendation that the task force had. And that's when Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya was created. And you see, now that there was a NADO in the country, then the NADO is able to take care of all the other issues, the other key findings that the task force had got in the investigations. So ADAK has been able to undertake a lot of testing, that is sample collection from athletes. We have been able to do a lot of education and outreaches for athletes in sports functions, even just as a classroom setting. The agency has also started values-based education for the younger athletes, the up-and-coming, those who are from the years of around 12, 13, 14. We have started that. We started doing compliance audits on the sports federations, and the audits are mainly just to make the federations aware that there's ADAK, there's something called doping, and this is what you're expected to do. You're expected to liaise with the NADO so that your athletes can get a lot of education, so that your athletes can also get tested, so that everyone is playing on a level field. And the agency has also been able to partner with the institution that does education curriculum in the country. That's the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development. And we are working together with them so that we can have an anti-doping curriculum. It might not be a whole curriculum on itself, but at least it will be embedded in the curriculum that school-going children are taught, either during their physical education lessons or any other sports lessons, or even just as a lesson on its own. So that is what the government did. And now once ADAK was formed, then we've taken up a lot of the key findings that the task force had, and we have worked to achieve what they recommended.
Definitely. And you mentioned that a lot of this does impact athletes, whether they are inadvertently doping, advertently doping, or not doping at all. So did you get a sense of just the general response of Kenyan athletes to a lot of these measures and things that you were doing there?
A lot of athletes and even their support personnel, these are the team managers and coaches and doctors, they've seen some of their fellow athletes take these medicines and really wondering, is this just a medication that this person is taking and they're not sick? What could it be? Some know that their fellow athletes were doping. Some people are not happy with how ADAK has come out full force to try and arrest the issue of doping in the country. So there's been mixed reactions. Majority of them are happy because then that means that at least, especially for the support personnel, they are assured that their athletes will get a fair chance in whatever event or race they are handed. But there are a few who are not happy. And so you might find that those athletes who know that they are doping, when they see ADAK personnel, you'll find them running away or telling each other that ADAK is in the area, so watch out and keep off and be on your best behavior. So there's been mixed reactions about that.
Certainly. And we mentioned that you're the lead over the standards and compliance section of the NATO there in Kenya. So what are the biggest challenges that you face in managing this area?
It's challenging because you have to be on top of things. You have to know what is happening in testing. You have to know what is happening in I&I. You have to know whether compliance audits are being carried out. How are the federations reacting to that? So the enormity of the work involved is challenging. The other challenge is especially because a lot of the work is on testing in the department, and testing is where there's a lot of issues, related issues to the code. And because we are really going all out looking for the athletes and taking a lot of their samples day in, day out, the athletes many times perceive us as an enemy. They look at us the way that somebody would look at a policeman or a policewoman. So we try to ensure that the education team has gone in somewhere before we do, just to educate them and let them know that we are just trying to ensure that everyone is playing clean. And then maybe the other challenge is there are a lot of risks involved in this department. So just anticipating the risks that are there and what could go wrong at any certain time, and knowing how to address those risks, whether it is immediately or even in the future. That is a challenge.
Certainly. So when you say risks, could you give us a couple examples of the kind of risk that you're talking about?
For example, for the sample collection personnel, they deal with a lot of elite athletes. These elite athletes earn a lot of money. So we have to keep on talking to the DCUs and the chaperones and the BCUs just to ensure that they are okay. Are we remunerating them well enough so that when they are out there, they are not at risk of being bribed, of being told to look away when an athlete is removing their sample, so that the sample is then compromised? When we are doing investigations, is our investigation officer okay? How is security? And security actually here is not only for the investigating officer, but even for the sample collection personnel, because there are a lot of times that they go to areas when they're doing out of competition tests and they go to a hostile area. There are times that people release their dogs on them or gang up together, threatening them to tell them go away and why are you always testing our athletes and things like that. So those are the risks that I'm talking about, and we have to be able to anticipate and know how to deal with them.
Certainly. And I think the recent COVID pandemic has introduced even more risks and more challenges on top of everything. So, Sarah, can you tell us how this has impacted your operations there at ADAK?
So we got our first case of COVID in March 2020. I mean, initially it was just, it's one case and it won't spread. But suddenly by April, June, the cases were really high. So the government at some point had to impose a lockdown, especially in Nairobi, where we are, which is the capital city, and some other areas. So there was restriction of movement. And of course, now there were a few months where we could do nothing. We could not go out to test. We could not go out to do any education. We could not go out to do any investigations or intelligence gathering. Results management was also affected because the government closed down the courts, because mainly it's physical attendance. So courts were closed down until they found out what to do. So initially, actually, our activities came to a halt for about 2 months, 3 months. But slowly we started getting ways to work through the pandemic. And especially when the government lifted up the restriction on movement, when it lifted it up a bit, we were able now to move. We have had curfew since last year. It's been more than a year now that we have curfew in the country because of the pandemic. So we have had to learn to work within the hours that we are allowed to work. So in some cities and some counties in the country, the curfew starts at 7 p.m. And in some counties and cities like Nairobi, the curfew starts at 10 p.m. So if you have a mission for athletes outside Nairobi, you have to know that by 6 p.m. you should have finished your mission so that by 7 p.m. everybody is in their house or hotel or whatever. But if it's in Nairobi, then you know you have at least until 9 because the government insists by 9 or 8:30 latest, everybody has gone home so that by 10 p.m. there's no one on the road. For education, they had to go online because the government had closed all sporting activities who were not allowed to have any sports. So they had to also get ways to do their education. And so Zoom and Microsoft Teams became their mode and their way of ensuring that athletes are still getting education, even though it was not physical. They also opened up an e-learning portal on the ADAK website. So athletes or even athlete support personnel can go onto their website and enter the e-learning portal and get some education on what anti-doping is about. So I think that is the way that COVID impacted our operations, Marie.
Sure. And you mentioned sort of developing these new educational resources and maybe shifting how you operate a little bit. Are there any changes that you made as a result of COVID, Sarah, that you think will stick around even once this pandemic is resolved?
Most of the changes that we did might not be permanent, but then again, COVID might be here to stay with us. Mm-hmm. So we adjusted how we do things. So for example, for testing, previously, unless we were collecting blood samples, wearing gloves was not a must because the sample collection personnel don't come into contact with the kit. But now it's mandatory for both the sample collection personnel and athletes to be in the PPEs, wear gloves for the sample collection personnel, wear the masks. So that is something that might stay. The e-learning portal, as I said, the online learning, that is something I think that will stay with us. Even if the pandemic goes away, we have realized that you can still do a lot online in as much as we'll get back to physical education sessions. So the e-learning portal is something that will for sure stay, and the online education sessions will stay. We were thinking of how the doping control process can be made faster, because right now we've been using paper DCFs and everything paper. So we want to go paperless, and that is something that WADA, I think, had started even before the pandemic came, just to reduce the contact with paper, because you don't know how far COVID can get when paper is being shared amongst many people. And so if we go digital, that is something that should stay and change permanently. So those are a few of the ways that the pandemic has changed what we do.
Certainly. And I think having to kind of rapidly adapt does have this silver lining. Like you mentioned, these educational resources could be far reaching. Some of these changes might be for the better, including going to paperless for the doping control collection. So I think the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya is doing phenomenal work there, and you're a relatively new NADO. So Sarah, when you think about the work that you've been doing there, what are some of the things that you see Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya doing particularly well at this point?
One of the areas I'll start is the values-based education for the young children. That is something that the education department has taken up and has run with it, and it's a program that's going very well. And they have a lot of participants and a lot of schools calling them just to ensure that the young ones are brought up well in ways of instilling the right morals, especially for those who are then going to participate in sports. So the values-based education is one thing that I know we are doing well. The other thing that we are doing well is investigations. It's a department, as you say, ADAK is young, yes, but the investigations department is really young. I think it's 2 years old or something. And what they are doing has borne a lot of fruit. And we are even assisting other anti-doping organizations outside of the country whenever they have a case on a Kenyan athlete where they need help in investigating some of the things that the Kenyan athletes have said, then they always come to the investigator, and the compliance officer does a very good job. And it has also helped us to be able to do a lot of target testing on our athletes where they get intelligence or where a whistleblower comes forth. We've been able to go with that case. The other area is collaborations. It's twofold. One is best practices. We have been working, and I think I mentioned this when I was starting, we've been working with Anti-Doping Norway. They are the ones who actually babied us and brought us up as a NADO up to where we are. Because, as I said, this was a new thing in the country, and none of us had any knowledge of how to start setting up a NADO and what to do. And so Anti-Doping Norway came in and helped us in a big way. We've had partnerships with them. We've had MOUs with them on this. The other ADO is UCAD. UCAD has also assisted us a lot in just areas where we feel we are still lagging behind. We know we are able to reach out to either Norway or UK, and they'll be there to help us. Then the other area of collaborations is testing, sample collection. And because of how we have grown and how we had to grow very fast because of pressure from WADA, our testing program has been doing well. And other anti-doping organizations, whether international federations or NADOs, have been contacting us to assist them with collecting samples, either for their athletes who are in our country or during major events. Like AIU has contacted us, I think when Nairobi hosted the World Under 18, we were the sample collection authority. We are going to be the sample collection authority during the World Athletics World Under 20 that will be held in Nairobi in August. We have done missions for international federations outside of Kenya in other countries, in our neighboring countries, for example, in Uganda. We have done a lot of missions there. We have done a lot of missions in Tanzania. We have done some missions in Rwanda. So I think because our sample collection personnel are also now have experience, at least 5 years experience now, and they are gaining with all the trainings that we are giving them, and they're more comfortable, they're more confident in doing the work that they're doing, and especially on blood collection. So this has helped us partner with other anti-doping organizations. So I think there are other areas that we are still working on, and we hope very soon we will get there and we'll be able to say that, yeah, ADAK has come of age.
Oh, that is phenomenal. And I think in general, I mean, clean sport is a global issue, particularly with so many international competitions these days. And the anti-doping community I found is very collegial and willing to help. Was this something that surprised you as you started making these connections and collaborating with other organizations?
Yeah, I mean, you are a young NADO. You are a country that I guess initially had their head in the sand on doping issues. So, you know, when you're starting out, you're a bit hesitant. Will these NADOs really want to assist us in getting our feet on the ground? So it was actually a pleasant surprise to see that, as you rightly put it, Marie, that the anti-doping fraternity is so together and very willing to assist each other. So they really held our hands and brought us to where we are. So yeah, that was a pleasant surprise and a nice one at that.
Definitely. And I know we've hinted at some of the challenges that you're facing now. Sarah, if you had to maybe narrow it down to one, what is the biggest issue right now that Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya is facing or focusing on at the moment?
I can say whereabouts failure, but within the whereabouts failure, there's an issue of athletes giving false documents. So any athlete who's in the registered testing pool, as you know, is expected to give their whereabouts every day. So you'll find that some athletes who are in the registered testing pool either do not update their whereabouts, or even if they update, are then not where they have said they are going to be within their 1 hour window. So when the sample collection personnel go to collect their samples, they are not there, which then now becomes a missed test. So the whereabouts failure is something that we are grappling with to see how best to address this. And for those athletes who either have a missed test, actually most of those who have a missed test, when they are giving, after you have contacted them to give a reason why, when they're giving their reason why, you will find 80% of them or 90% of them will give a reason, but they'll also give false information and support their information with false documentation. So that is an area that we are having a challenge with. It's one of the biggest issues we have, and we want to see how best to go about it.
Definitely. So do you have a sense of, I guess, the numbers or the proportion of made versus missed tests?
On the RTP, missed tests are not as many as the filing failures. So the filing failures is where they have given wrong information in their whereabouts, or they have just not updated their whereabouts at all. So for missed tests, I would say it's about 40%, but the filing failures would be 60%.
So do you have thoughts on what you can do, maybe drawing from other anti-doping organizations to potentially address this issue?
We are working with the federations just to see how we can get these athletes and give them more education on just that topic of whereabouts. And our education team has actually started with the online meetings. And this was even enhanced because of the new international standard for education. So when they're having these sessions, they've had 2 sessions so far. When they're having these sessions, we really ask them to emphasize on the issue of whereabouts, both the filing failures and the missed tests. So we want to see whether this will improve the athletes and their filings, and whether it will also improve their obeying their own 1 hour time slot.
So I guess looking forward then, Sarah, do you have an idea of what some of the main goals are for Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya in terms of what you're working towards in the next 5 to 10 years?
We are looking to, 1, increase our tests. So the number of samples that we are collecting, we started, I think, with about 500 tests when we were first established. And for us, that was huge. But we have been growing year by year. And right now we are doing about 1,200 tests in a year. But we want to grow this. We are looking at a target of 3,000 tests in the next 10 years. One of the reasons is because we have a huge, huge pool of athletes in this country. Not only track and field, but soccer players and volleyball players and swimmers and netball, all sorts of sports. So we want to know that we are growing our tests so that we can try to cover as many sports persons as we can. So our focus is growing to 3,000, at least 3,000. It will then give the country or the ministry a basis in which to establish a laboratory for analysis of samples, a WADA accredited lab, because one of the thresholds for WADA to accredit any lab is that they should be able to analyze at least 3,000 samples in a year. So in as much as we would want whichever lab it will be to work for the region, but we need, as the NADO in Kenya, to be able to promise them that, yes, we're able to give you the 3,000 tests. And so if you start your thing, you're up and running and you're accredited by WADA, at least you are comfortable that you'll get that number of samples from us, and then try and get other samples from other countries within the region. The other thing is that we've been talking about this with the WADA Africa office at helping other countries establish NADOs. And so we want to be the big brother or the big sister and just hold other people's hand the way other NADOs assisted us. So we want to be able to help other countries establish NADOs, because especially in Africa, in this region, we don't have many NADOs. Not all countries have. I think there are about 4 or 5 in South Africa, in Kenya, in Egypt, in Ethiopia, and Uganda. Those are the few countries that I know that have. Other countries are starting to establish, like Nigeria and Ghana, but they are not yet fully fledged. So we would want to be able to be that NADO that is giving assistance and helping them just establish and know what to do, especially because our environment and our geographical environments are so different from maybe Europe or the Americas. And so we hope we will be able to assist them get to at least where we are right now. And then maybe the last one is just to ensure that the new standards that have been established by WADA, the one on education and the one on resource management, are properly implemented and full compliance is adhered to. And especially on the one for resource management, the issue of the cases taking not more than 6 months to complete. Because previously we've had some of our cases going on for long, almost up to a year. Those are a few of the goals that we are looking at between now and 5 or 10 years to come. But I'm sure as we continue to grow as an agency, there are other things that will come up.
Certainly. Well, it sounds like you've got a great direction there and a lot of work to do.
Yes, we do.
Oftentimes, things like resources and other barriers can stand in the way or make it difficult for you. So, Sarah, I'm curious, if we took away all of the barriers that are usually staring you down and maybe gave you all of the resources you could possibly dream up, do you have one problem in anti-doping that you would want to solve most?
There are many problems, but the area that I would want us to fund more than we do right now is the area of scientific research and innovation in anti-doping. And this is because there's a lot to gain from research being done in anti-doping. I mean, apart from knowing the trends, but the main thing is that right now with the anti-doping scenario, especially in Kenya, and I'm sure my colleagues and other NADOs might attest to this also, is that the athletes and their support personnel or whoever is helping them dope for those who do dope are a step or two ahead of the NADO. It's like we are trying to play catch up in as much as we are doing a lot of sample collection and testing. But if we could get money to put into research and innovation, then we could get ways of being at par with the athletes who are doping, such that if they came up with a new substance or a new concoction which could help enhance their performance, we would be right there knowing that if they take this and we use this for analysis, then it will catch them on the spot. Instead of right now, and that is why we have the ABP program or the issue of sample storage, that new ways come up maybe 2, 3, 4 years down the line. And that is when you are able to test a sample that has been stored for years and to know that this person was taking performance-enhancing substances. So that is one area that I would put money into.
Definitely. Well, this area of anti-doping research and innovation is, of course, near and dear to the PCC's heart. So we definitely are on board with you there. And we appreciate you dreaming big with us on the show, as well as sharing all of these insights and expertise throughout our conversation. But Sarah, if our listeners want to learn more about you and more about the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, what is the best way for them to do so?
They can visit our website because there's a lot on our website. The website is www.adak.or.ke. So that's www.adak.or.ke. We also have other social media pages. Our Facebook is Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, and our Twitter is ADAK Kenya. So they can get in touch with us, and we would for sure respond to whatever it is that they need.
Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely check out the website for the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya and get connected on social media. And Sarah, it has been such a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Marie. It's been a pleasure to be with you on this podcast.
Well, it's been wonderful to have you here as well. Listeners, as always, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you'll be there for the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.